This is a continuation of the concept of how to deal with Legionnaires Disease as it is explained to various countries that seem to contact it from time to time. And as I noted in several other pieces that I have made for YouTube, Legionnaires Disease was a totally new disease in 1976, in the summer of 1976, which um, essentially is confined to one hotel in Philadelphia and was investigated fully. But some of the people who were the mavericks, so to speak, were part of a investigation which somehow didn't reach the people who were involved in trying to define that at the CDC. And as I've said, it is pretty close to the same idea of what we might say is, at least on one level, conspiratorial. And because there are equations that you can make and create in terms of industry, especially the use of certain gases in air conditioning. At the time, it was the DuPont and other Raytheon using a gas, an unstable gas called freon or F11, and also just practically known as R11 or F11 or F12. But in the older hotel in Philadelphia, this is where it all starts. So why is it so limited? Today, the publication of the 6 dead in Quebec Legionnaires Disease outbreak is published, and I had previously addressed Scotland and just asking questions, but basically it's more interesting when you're looking at Canada because there was an advocate in Canada, a doctor, whose main purpose was to call attention to the fact that he could identify absolutely and unequivocally the facts that the CDC was trying to show were incorrect, and that he knew, and he had a complete picture of what he thought the reason was. This was based on a theory that had been well known to welders particularly, and to the United States military in terms of their underwater craft, where welding was done on submarine. There was a lieutenant commander by the name of Lavangi who had passed on some information to me while I was employed at the Brown and Williamson project, and he was very, very careful not to commit himself, but he gave me certain information that led me to believe that there was a conspiracy. The conspiracy was certainly found in, and can be found, as a leader of how we interpreted certain things in the hearings. And what I'm holding up here is one of the hearings, which were held in 1976 and 77. And these hearings both presented how much the CDC did not do, but referred to certain aspects of a disease which had not yet been defined, but was found perhaps in a petri dish more than anything else as a bacteria. And so the theory that the CDC was left with although it was questioned by many people who happen to know what phosgene gas was doing. And therefore, because of so many industrial interests, so much interest by DuPont, for example, and so much interest by the tobacco companies, for example, particularly Merit cigarettes, because it had an expanded tobacco process which used a freezing system, causing emissions into the ozone layer. But this is one of the hearings. You should read it. It's found in November. This one is in November 23rd and 24th, 1976, in the government publication, U.S. government printing office. And the serial number 94-159, hearings for the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Finance, Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce, House of Representatives. This is just one hearing, but what comes from this is essentially a man who, there are several people who are involved and know chemistry and know how some things work and some things were built, particularly going back to the gassing of the first use of phosgene gas, which is a legal gas to be used during World War I. There were disadvantages in this, but I'm not going to go into why they stopped using or used it for their particular purposes, but there were measurements which caused various lung disabilities, and certain people would be exposed on one level and would totally survive without any effect whatsoever, and later it would pop up. Or it wouldn't pop up, depending on where the exposure was, because of the conditions of exposure. All right, so in this present taping on the 6 dead in Quebec, let me bring up again the facts that there was a lot of controversy, but it wasn't the CDC. The CDC in 1976 was held out as an instrument of the administration, particularly in terms of who was guiding and directing what was said and what wasn't said, what was researched. The concept of the CDC was to find reasonable causes, and they decided on a bacterial cause. But the clues are found in some of the other things. In your reading of the hearings, you won't see a lot that eliminates a suspicion for the use of tobacco products, especially those as in terms of what I have described before. And I think that when you look at this, it's been here so long, it became established by the medical community as the Legionnaires Disease, and so caused by an infection, caused by a bacteria. And these hearings in 76 and 77 certainly delineate and define for you what the corporate problems were. And so CDC, which is not totally without its guidance from government. At the time, there was a pro-tobacco administration, in spite of the fact that basically it was Carter's administration, the peanut farmer, which has the same controls as the tobacco company, and growing tobacco. And so the findings were limited because the people just wouldn't hear. However, it was established in post-war American military knowledge that submariner technicians aboard a closed environment like a submarine, using a torch and smoking, would cause phosgene gas. And ask today, ask today to any refrigeration person the same questions, and they will tell you that you can certainly create phosgene gas. And phosgene gas may be the culprit. And what is left out of the hearings for the Philadelphia event in 1976 is that which is questioned by those who are rogues, or so to speak, are not following the CDC. And the CDC purposely takes us along the path of a couple of things that actually point to some of the realities that exist. Now, if you accept the bacterial theory, that's fine. However, a very, very, very adamant theory was developed by a Canadian who was a doctor who had a lot of interest in terms of determining why these leaking air conditioners, leaking this very volatile gas, why this was happening and not being recognized as part of the problem, or the main issue of the problem. And there was a film actually made by Canadian Broadcasting, and this film was rejected by the United States completely, so Canada made it. I mean, that's usually what happens if you have a controversy, and it's going to affect American industry, which it would. Canada goes over and does a film, and essentially what they did is documented this particular evidence that the man was projecting. He basically was saying, autopsy the lungs of the victims, and you'll find an effect of phosgene gas, the same kind of effect, which affects the lungs, the burnt, crisp. And this is for those who die, of course. You don't obviously autopsy those who are alive, but some things are not clear in the CDC evaluation, and it just disappears completely. Then it's now currently being studied under the aegis of the holiest of holy of the tobacco land, Louisville, Kentucky. I think it's the University of Louisville that has a program going on to study more about the Legionnaires Disease. Remember, this has not occurred before 1976. Then all of a sudden you have it. Then all of a sudden you have little bitty parts of it, in like cruise ships and so forth. So, not to repeat myself, but the things that they found, the rogues, the mavericks, and these were people who had bona fides, and they were actually very distinguished. And one of them was this Canadian doctor, at least on film, which was done as a documentary of his work, and his disagreement was done by Canadian television, and they're on record, probably on your file somewhere. See it. Get the files. It's the Canadian Broadcasting, and Canadian Broadcasting does a very good work, and it basically says that, listen, you're dealing with escaped phosgene gas from an area, which, if you look at the theories of both Scotland and Canada in Montreal, quote, there are 68 cooling towers housed in 28 buildings, and these were inspected. So both, and this also was repeated in Scotland about the cooling towers. Well, the cooling towers have a means of using refrigerated air and heat, and so the other parts of this is that it goes into a building. Now, there are various theories that come out in these hearings that you got sort of get some hints. There was a lot of pressure from corporates corporate people, and they were essentially saying, let's see if we can't get it down to the simple issue. It's called a bacteria. It's called. It comes from water. And quoting from this, health authorities suspect improper maintenance of cooling towers in air conditioning. Again, there's the secret word: air conditioning. But what about air conditioning? It leaks, and if it leaks, it can cause. Let's just say you're getting air conditioning in a close environment where there are people close to an open flame, which produces the heat that's necessary. Well, this is no big state secret. Obviously, this man went around on like a bandwagon, and he was filmed in Canada because they wouldn't let him be filmed here in 1976. I think there were two issues. One was the fact that the men who were actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for the ozone layer depletion concept chased it down to the CFCs and said, yes, it's due to this. And there's try and die and methyl. It's all convoluted in one way or another. And to me, I'm not a chemist, so I'm just reading the words, but it's very clear that these things are present to form phosgene gas. And the phosgene gas can be in certain measurements. And someone who's smoking a cigarette, for example, or standing near a Bunsen burner, or something like what is that? Something that heats a dish in a big room where hotel staff are sitting around serving other people. You have those things, and you have air conditioning coming into the building. Well, that was the theory. And the CDC didn't want to investigate that, and didn't. And yet the people who were looking at this were people who had documented evidence from the submarine incidents that were occurring, which basically said, essentially, don't ever let a torch come near inside an enclosed environment in a submarine. And this had become adopted theory. And if you're smoking, you're definitely going to get phosgene gas, as you do today. Now, there's really no difference between the new and the old air conditioning. It's just simply it means, okay, the Montreal Accord, or the agreement made by the Montreal Convention, and then in the Kyoto Treaty, which I think the United States is not a member, but nevertheless, all of these things have to do with industrial concepts of freezing. And the instrumentation of that is the use of phosgene, of freon, or the newer freon, which is supposed not to have the same effect on the ozone layer. Well, I don't think that's real, but nevertheless, it did increase sales and costs, and ask any refrigeration person who comes into contact with phosgene. Just a very minor incident with a torch will cause a deadly embolism in the lungs, or in some cases, cardiac condition. Immediately, a situation which, if you have an immune system that's compromised, can cause and will cause death. It's interesting when you look at these facts and you say, okay, how many deaths were there in 1976? Well, there were a lot of deaths in 1976 because nobody knew what to deal with, how to deal with it. And it was always a bacteria. And then the medical community decided to call it Legionella bacteria, which is, of course, a possibility. But if you did the examinations that were necessary, one, if you went back and read the hearings in the United States, and if you could visualize how in those 30 some odd years ago, when this first incident, and things that happen first are always something that tell us what to look for in the future. And we have had very few incidents of this so-called Legionnaires Disease. And so doctors treat it with erythromycin, and that's those patients who haven't had much exposure at work. That's a perfect theory. And to some extent, people will have lung damage. And this is principally a lung damage, and it can be lethal, and it will be lethal under certain conditions. So the fascinating part is, one, you're still looking under the theory of the Mavericks, who presented their point of view, and it's on tape. There is a tape that exists in Canadian TV, unless they destroyed it. I don't know whether that would be the thing that would happen. Nevertheless, if you heard how adamant this man was, how much he's a medical doctor, and he wanted to, and he ends up crying in the end because nobody will listen to him. Not that he's absolutely right or wrong. It's just a historical record. And so, having looked at at least what the tobacco interests were, to not have product disparagement, because in the Legionnaires Disease case in Philadelphia, the people who were involved in deciding what was going on had introduced to all the Legionnaires cigarettes called Merit, which was expanded tobacco, which used the process of freezing tobacco, and so I'm quite certain that this has not stopped. It has something to do with the Montreal covenant, so to speak, and certainly the Kyoto Treaty. To me, I would say, and just off the cuff, I really don't remember all of the details, but I know that as of a certain point, the United States is not a member of the Kyoto Treaty, which has to do with the expelling of useless or expended gases, such as the Freon 11 and the newer type Freon 11, which is really no different. But the point being that in the Legionnaires situation, you had one hotel, and then to some extent another hotel, but basically the staff never got anything because they were always moving around. One person standing in one position under an air conditioning or near an air conditioning unit was getting a bacteria, or were they getting the effects of something that with a lit cigarette or with something that could get heat to the intensity level of 600 degrees Fahrenheit, at least, then you have only the thing to deal with is what is the coke catalyst, because the formula for the Mavericks, at least, who were not given a good hearing, but they do appear in the hearing, at least one, and give voice to their theories, which are totally confirmed by air conditioned people today. And this is the odd part. You have not only the escaping freon, which goes into the cooling system, it gets into the air ducts, or it goes through the air ducts some way, and it carries down, and it is caught into a system where people are using some kind of heat. And the heat, which also may be converted already due to the tower systems and the old air conditioning. And the final measure of this is just one use of a puffing on a cigarette, which happens to be the case in the analysis and the hearings. They mentioned that you use this and it forms at the tip a coke catalyst. The coke catalyst being everything you need to form that particular kind of lung disabling disease. In many cases, only one little puff, or that's what they analyze in the hearing. So, two things to mention. Montreal has the same thing, and as Scotland, and they're both coming together. An interesting part of this is that it's still called the largest Legionnaires outbreak in Canada in recent years. How many cases do we really have? How many incidents have we really had? Not very many if you really had a disease out there. And what was happening before that? What was happening before 1976, in the summer of 1976? Why did we have this? Well, the DuPont people had conveniently allowed us to be noticed in 1933 when they came out with the idea that if you break this gas and you have some kind of heat near it, be careful, because the gas itself can be lethal. One little piece. And confirm this with an air conditioning person, because exactly the same thing is happening. You know, these people are aware of this. These people know this. But in the largest incident in Canada, the health authorities suspect improper maintenance of cooling towers in the air. Okay? Gives you a hint that they know something, but they still insist Legionella bacteria in stagnant water. It's a waterborne disease. It's not an airborne disease. Or, in fact, as the CDC used quite a bit of subterfuge in ignoring what was coming up and out of the mouths of those people who were dissenting on their point of view. It's a little bit upsetting when you think that all these years and the few incidents that have occurred have given credibility to the Faustian theory. And maybe it's not something to be hysterical about, because, let's see, only 6 people are killed, 65 people infected. Well, I don't know. Autopsies are usually the things that give you some kind of credible evidence of how this comes about. And maybe if you looked at the tape that was made for Canadian broadcasting and was released in 1977, I think, you can find what one person, an older doctor who had been totally convinced, among other people, that this was caused, as stated, by the factors of contact with the released or leaking gas, which then was R11 or F11. And today we have, since the Nobel Peace Prize was given to 2 gentlemen who were investigating the use of these CFCs, and the greatest capacity of use is in industrial use. They use it to make all sorts of things, particularly the interesting part is tobacco products. And maybe that's why we don't belong to the Kyoto. I don't know. Maybe there's some reason. Maybe it's not. Maybe this is all just a witch hunt or a correct thing. But why is there? Why? Why is there centralized in this a kind of coordination among the biggest tobacco place in the world? For the British, at least, it's still their headquarters. Brown and Williamson, located in Louisville, Kentucky. So, as a former whatever I did, I have this on my mind and can't get it out. And I know that if you had some interest in terms of your health, people, not only would you try to find that tape, but you would also, which incidentally is available through the Association of people who control environment. One of the defenses for tobacco is sick building syndrome. So there you are. I mean, this didn't come about until suddenly after this sort of thing came out. Then we developed this big building system, which was by a man who was paid by a special account from short-party bacon, actually through the tobacco. Whoops! I think that Norton is trying to get through here. Oh my. Anyway, purpose in this is just a shocking kind of revelation, which says, look at the tapes. Look at the tape if you can find it. I'm sure you can. Canada keeps things like tapes. It was fairly recent by the standards, although the taping procedures are different. You still have an archive or a morgue for this kind of thing. There's one gentleman who complains, and this was not done here deliberately in the United States because of the corporate interest, I would assume. He couldn't get a hearing, but he was adamant. He was totally thorough. He was a doctor. And just like all doctors who developed and went to medical school between 1976 and now, we have a bacterial disease. Some of it is hinted at in cooling towers in Scotland, refrigeration, so forth. But I think this is a pretty good point here. I mean, and reality is that not only do we have some evidence of the heating of the planet, and in Ghana, so we have a horrible condition throughout this year. And this is a 50-year drought or a 60-year drought. I almost feel like going and reading Steinbeck and saying, oh my God, or maybe going back to the plague or something. But essentially, when you have these Legionnaire diseases, concepts are everything. And one thing I was told by a very good journalist by the name of Morton is, it doesn't matter how old something is if it was, in fact, or if you think it was, a conspiracy. You know, it's all news. It's not old. It's news. And so I'm saying those people in Montreal, and that's where we all agree that we don't want to destroy the planet. So CFCs, which were approved, certainly to the extent that we've accepted the Nobel Peace Laureates theories that they do destroy the ozone layer, has something to do with the industrial production en masse of this kind of refrigeration. And we all want refrigeration, and we want this, but at the same time, is it still going into the environment? That's the question. Why is it being controlled, to some extent, by Louisville, Kentucky, which is the God spell of the national or ethnocentristic protection of Legionnaires disease. And somebody there is investigating how we can project more propaganda out there that this is the reason. You don't have to have a lot of propaganda. Just ask a refrigeration person who's got a torch in front, or is using a lighter for a cigarette, and escaping freon of any kind. The newer, the older, it doesn't matter. Same thing. They just make more money out of it, and there are several companies that do this. And what would you think if you knew that millions of pounds of this expelled freon were going into the environment and creating a closer connection with the destruction of the multi-layers of the ozone? And if the ozone is still being depleted, and that seems to be the case, you have the Nobel laureates who prove it. So why question that? And if the connection here is between Legionnaires disease outbreak, which is very infrequent, and the same concept, you know, you got two different issues, but they're both polemic. They both have a lot of kind of spleen, where you're really agitating the status quo. And that's what I'm here doing. So, gee, I don't know. Norton keeps coming in, beep, 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 and so maybe I'm saying something. And maybe it's not really what somebody wants to hear. But anyway, the fact is, what's happening in Scotland, what's happening in Quebec, apparently, deaths and mainly people who've been exposed to phosgene gas. Possible? Probable? Who's looking into it? Well, I've given you references. The hearings in 1976, 1977, the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Senate, and there you go. And then you have that one tape, that wonderful tape that only Canada would do. Canada did the tape of the doctor who was absolutely convinced that the phosgene theory existed, among other people as well, but not with the CDC, because politically it was impossible. You had a Carter administration, you had a Carter guy named, I think it was Brooke, who was the medicine man for all of the theories, and so you really didn't have an opportunity to have somebody who was going to be totally unbiased. Today you have a kind of biased situation where Legionnaires Disease is being investigated in Louisville, Kentucky, and the control of it has been through there. Louisville, Kentucky, Ronald Williamson, that's it. Okay? I am still convinced that somewhere in the records here, there should be questioning. And yet we live in a world where we're not really doing that, because we're accepting just these deaths. I mean, 6 deaths here, 6 deaths there, That's 16 cases found on Thursday alone. Well, I believe that our medical technology today can actually come up with with more rather than less evidence that this is not just a bacteria. It has something to do with escape freon gas, which comes into contact with a air conditioning system duct, which comes out and meets with something that has to do with intense heat. Well, it's 600 degrees Fahrenheit plus. And that's the tip of the cigarette, by the way. And other things as well. Certainly the staff at the Legionnaires Hotel in Philadelphia, where you had the Legionnaires, 2,000 of them, came there. The staff, which is always moving around, I mean, people were always moving around, generally didn't have any effect whatsoever. But the people who were near something where the air was coming out, and even if it was inside, they came down with variations of the disease, which some were not as exposed and some were exposed, which makes perfect sense. But remember, this is the introduction of a expanded tobacco product, which is made by freeze-drying a product called tobacco. And by freezing it, I mean you're using it for an process. They knew this in 1976, and one of the things that should be recorded is a record produced by a lawyer firm, Ronald Williamson, which states unequivocally that, since I've been using it for so many years, and remember, air conditioning doesn't go back that far, it goes back into the late 30s or the mid 30s, and then so the breakdown would occur over a period of time. Now, where we are is that time. We were that way back in 1976. But why is this always on somebody's agenda as a bacteria or worm or something like that in the water? It's highly suspicious, and was, as the first taping made, when I said, it was a conspiracy by the CDC. Accept it for what it is, but go find that tape It's in Canada. It was done by Canada because the United States wouldn't do it. It has a doctor who was confirming it. In his opinion, everything that the rogues who were there in Philadelphia and those who were reporting it in the newspaper, who managed to disappear somewhere and then never got back to the newspapers when they reported this. Anyway, that's the story. And I hope it is enlightening to some extent. It's very interesting. If it's not, at least to me, I have sort of a fascination with conspiracy theories, but nevertheless, I really don't think there is much difference in this in 1976. Maybe there is. As I've said, in Scotland, the case was about a distillery. Maybe this one has a closed environment as well, a closed-in environment as well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.